Let's dive right in. Imagine ancient India, somewhere between 600 BCE and 600 CE. It's a time of massive change. You've got new cities rising, empires forming, and these incredible stories being told, like the Mahabharata.
Hmm.
But how did society actually work back then? I mean, who was in charge? How are families structured? And how did people navigate the rules of their time? Rules that sometimes feel incredibly distant and sometimes, well, surprisingly familiar.
That's exactly what we're here to explore today.
Yeah.
Our core mission in this deep dive really is to unlock insights into those complex layers of kinship, caste, and class that shaped these early Indian societies.
Right.
We're going to try and peel back the layers, understand the social mechanics of, well, 1,000 years of history.
And our source material for this is just incredibly rich, isn't it? We're drawing on ancient texts that have survived for millennia.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff.
The epic Mahabharata, which in its present form is absolutely colossal, over 100,000 verses, detailing just a vast range of social life. Then you've got the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, those detailed legal and social codes like the Manusmriti.
The rule books, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Plus inscriptions carved in stone that give us glimpses into real practices, and even accounts left behind by ancient travelers who visited the subcontinent.
And the Mahabharata, it wasn't just written down once, was it? It evolved over something like 1,000 years, starting around 500 BCE.
1,000 years.
Yeah. And while the core story is that famous feud between the Kauravas and Pandavas, the text also grew to include these huge sections laying down social norms, offering advice on everything from kingship to family life.
So we're essentially taking this massive stack of information,
Sure.
epic tales, legal codes, stone records, traveler's notes, and we're distilling it.
Trying to, anyway.
We want to pull out the most important nuggets, the surprising facts, the contradictions, and maybe give you that shortcut to understanding how society was structured, what the ideal rules were meant to be.
And how people actually live their lives within, around, or sometimes, against them.
And it's vital to remember that understanding this requires really careful analysis. We can't just read these ancient texts like a newspaper. Right?
Definitely not.
Historians have to ask, who wrote this? Who were they writing for? What was their agenda? Were they trying to describe reality, or were they trying to dictate norms?
Yeah, the should be versus the was.
Exactly. The texts often tell us how things should be, but real life was messy, diverse, and often quite different from the prescriptions laid down.
That's the fascinating challenge, isn't it? Trying to reconstruct the lived experience from sources that might be biased or, well, idealized.
It is. But by looking across different types of sources, we can start to piece together a much more nuanced picture of the attitudes and practices that shaped social history.
Okay.
The texts give us insight into the intentions behind social rules and hierarchies, even as we see evidence of those rules being negotiated, adapted, or maybe even challenged in the historical record. Okay, so how do historians even begin to approach something as vast and complicated as, say, the Mahabharata, especially when we know it changed over time and existed in all these different versions? It must be like trying to find the original needle in a haystack of editions.
It's a huge undertaking, absolutely. The challenge of ancient texts is precisely that layering and variation. And, many key texts, like the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras, were written in Sanskrit.
Right.
Primarily by and for Brahmanas, aiming to establish their authority and specific social norms. So to get beyond just that one perspective, historians really need to look much more broadly.
So how do they tackle that complexity, particularly with a monster like the Mahabharata?
Well, a prime example is the monumental project to create the critical edition of the Mahabharata. This was, one of the most ambitious scholarly endeavors ever in India. Started way back in 1919.
Wow, 1919. What did that project actually involve? Sounds massive.
Oh, it was. The goal was to compile a definitive version of the epic by collecting as many Sanskrit manuscripts as possible from across the entire subcontinent.
The whole thing? North to south?
Yep. They gathered manuscripts from Kashmir in the north, right down to Kerala in the south, in all sorts of different local scripts. It was just an immense collection effort.
And then comparing all of those, that sounds painstaking.
It was. A team of dozens of scholars worked for, get this, 47 years.
47 years!
I know. They developed a method to systematically compare verses from every single manuscript. Their aim was to identify the verses that were common to most versions, across different regions. These common verses formed the basis of the main text in the critical edition.
47 years. That's incredible dedication. So what was the outcome? Did they find one single, unified story lurking underneath all the variations?
Well, what they found fundamentally changed how we understand the text. There were really two key findings. First, yes, there were several common elements in the Sanskrit versions found across vast distances.
Okay.
A core story, and certain passages were remarkably consistent from north to south. So that suggests a widespread recognition of the main narrative.
Okay, so consistency across regions. Makes sense. What was the second finding?
The second, and maybe even more significant finding, was the enormous regional variation in how the text had been transmitted and added to over the centuries. These variations were so extensive that they were meticulously documented in footnotes and appendices.
And how much space did these variations take up? You said it was a lot.
More than half of the resulting 13,000 pages are dedicated to these regional differences.
Wait. More than half.
Yep. Think about that. More pages recording variations than the main text itself.
That is wild. More variations than the core text. What does that tell historians about this period? That can't just be mistakes.
No, it's hugely revealing about the complex social histories. These variations aren't just scribal errors. They reflect this constant dialogue happening between dominant traditions, often represented by the Brahmana-authored Sanskrit text, and these dynamic local ideas and practices.
Ah, so it's like a conversation playing out in the text itself.
Exactly. The epic wasn't static. It was constantly being reinterpreted, added to, shaped by local communities and different social groups. It shows this process of conflict and consensus as local traditions interacted with the broader, more standardized Sanskrit versions.
That makes so much sense. It wasn't just one version dictated from on high. It was a living text reflecting the back and forth across the whole subcontinent.
Precisely. And this realization spurred historians to look beyond just the dominant Sanskrit texts. Initially, when studying social history, many scholars relied heavily on Sanskrit works like the Dharmashastras.
Right, assuming they were just describing reality.
Exactly, believing that whatever the Manusmriti said, that's just how people lived. But by studying texts in other languages, Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil, which were used by wider segments of the population, a much more complex picture emerged.
Ah, languages beyond Sanskrit.
Right. These other traditions show that while Brahma norms held influence, they were also questioned, adapted, and at times outright rejected in practice or in alternative intellectual traditions.
So to really get a handle on social history, you have to look at where the norms are not being followed, where different practices exist, and where alternative ideas are being expressed.
Absolutely. That's where you see the real dynamism and complexity of how society actually functioned.
Okay, let's apply this approach then. Let's dive into the first major area, family and kinship. We often think of family as this universal constant, right? But the way it's structured and understood can vary dramatically.
It really does. While families typically involve people sharing resources, living and working together, performing rituals, the definition of who belongs to your kin group varies. Concepts like kula for family, nati for the wider kin network, or vamsha for lineage, they're defined differently. Even something seemingly simple like who counts as a cousin or what a blood relation means can vary across societies. These ties, while feeling natural, are fundamentally socially defined,
Yeah, that makes sense. And when historians study ancient societies, how easy is it to see what family life was like for everyone, not just, say, the kings and queens?
Well, it's much easier to study elite families, like ruling dynasties or prominent Brahmana households.
Because they left records.
Exactly. Their lives, successions, notable events were more likely to be recorded in texts or inscriptions. Reconstructing the daily texture of family life for ordinary people is much, much more challenging.
Right.
However, by analyzing the attitudes towards family and kinship expressed in the sources, we can infer a lot about the values and expectations that shaped people's actions.
And the Mahabharata, of course, is a story built entirely on a family feud, isn't it?
It is, fundamentally. The central conflict between the Kauravas and the Pandavas is a dispute within a single ruling family, the Kurus, over control of land and power. And the Pandavas' eventual victory culminates in the reestablishment and proclamation of patrilineal succession as the dominant principle.
Patriliny, meaning descent traced through the father, and inheritance passing from father to son.
Correct. Sons are the crucial link in this system, inheriting property, status, and for rulers, the throne. Now, while Patriliny certainly existed before the epic, the Mahabharata's central narrative strongly reinforced its value, and presented it as the correct model for succession, especially for ruling lineages.
And did ruling dynasties actually follow this patrilineal ideal in practice?
Well, from around the 6th century BCE onwards, most ruling dynasties claimed to follow Patriliny. That was the ideal they presented.
Claim to.
Right. But historical record shows variations. Sometimes a king died without sons and a brother might succeed him. In other cases, other kinsmen might step in or claim the throne. And very occasionally, exceptional women might exercise power, though these instances were rare, like Prabhavati Gupta, for example.
So the ideal was patriliny, but reality often threw up complications that required, well, alternative arrangements.
Exactly. And this concern with patriliny extended beyond just royal succession. It's deeply embedded in ritual texts, like the Rig Veda, dating back even earlier, maybe around 1000 BCE. There's a Rig Veda mantra, still part of many Hindu marriage rituals today, that vividly illustrates this focus.
Really? What does that mantra say?
Well, it's chanted by the priest during the wedding, and it says something like, "I free her from here, but not from there. I have bound her firmly there, so that through the grace of Indra she will have fine sons and be fortunate in her husband's love."
Wow. I free her from here, but not from there.
That's a really powerful statement about the transfer of the bride, isn't it? From one lineage to another.
It is. Here refers to the bride's paternal home, and there refers to her new home, her husband's house. And the explicit mention of fine sons highlights the primary expectation placed on the bride within her husband's patrilineal lineage to ensure its continuity by bearing male heirs.
And fortunate in her husband's love, it underscores her dependence in the new family. It does. It highlights the gendered roles and expectations within this system. The groom is gaining a partner to continue his line, while the bride is leaving her family to join a new one, with the clear expectation of producing sons.
This emphasis on sons and lineage is the very source of the conflict in the Mahabharata, right? Source 2 from the Adi Parvan gives us a direct insight into how the feud started.
Exactly. Let's unpack that. So, the story tells us the Kauravas are the 100 sons of King Dhritarashtra, and the Pandavas are their cousins, the 5 sons of Dhritarashtra's younger brother Pandu.
Okay.
Now, Pandu became king because Dhritarashtra was blind, a defect that apparently disqualified him initially. When Pandu died, Dhritarashtra took the throne as regent while the princes were young.
But as the princes grew up, the people favored the Pandavas, didn't they?
Right. The source says the citizens of Hastinapura saw the Pandavas as more capable and virtuous than the Kauravas. This popular support, combined with the whole question of succession, fueled this intense jealousy in Duryodhana, Dhritarashtra's eldest son.
And Duryodhana confronts his father about this. What's his core argument? What's he saying?
His argument is rooted entirely in the principle of patrilineal succession and this deep anxiety of exclusion. He tells his father, essentially, look, you didn't get the throne because you're blind. If the Pandava, Yudhishthira, inherits from Pandu, then his son will inherit, and his son after that.
And his fear is that his own line, the Kaurava line, will be completely cut out from the succession.
Exactly. He warns Dhritarashtra, we ourselves with our sons shall be excluded from the royal succession and become of slight regard in the eyes of the world, lord of the earth. He sees the Pandavas inheriting from Pandu as a direct threat to his own line's claim to the throne, based on being the sons of the elder brother Dhritarashtra.
This passage clearly reflects the author's obsession with lineage and succession. The source notes that these passages might not be strict history, but they reveal the ideas that were shaping the narrative, right?
They give us insight into the values and conflicts the authors were grappling with. And the source also points out that the passage contains kind of conflicting ideas about what makes a legitimate king.
Conflicting ideas? How so?
Well, Duryodhana is arguing for birthright based on patrilineal descent through his father, the elder brother. But the text also presents the citizens' preference for the Pandavas based on their capability and virtue.
Ah, okay. Merit versus birthright.
And remember, the initial reason Dhritarashtra didn't rule was his blindness, suggesting a physical defect could override birthright. So the source prompts us to ask, which criteria for kingship are suggested here? Birth, capability, virtue, lack of defect. And which criteria might the authors implicitly suggest are justified or unjust?
Right. Duryodhana feels his claim based on birth from the elder brother's line is just, and being excluded is unjust. But the citizens, and perhaps the epic's narrative arc itself, suggest that capability and virtue are also crucial. And perhaps a blind ruler or his line losing out is, in some sense, justified by circumstance or merit. It's a clash between different principles of legitimacy, really.
It is. The epic uses this conflict to explore these very ideas about what constitutes a valid claim to power within a patrilineal system.
So within this patrilineal framework, sons are key. Daughters, as you mentioned, were treated quite differently.
Yes, daughters generally had no claims on the resources of the paternal household in the same way sons did. They were seen as belonging to a different lineage after marriage.
And marrying them outside their own kin group, exogamy, that was the ideal?
Precisely. For families seeking to maintain or enhance their status, marrying daughters into suitable families outside their immediate kin group was considered highly desirable. And this concern led to relatively strict regulation of upper status women's lives, ensuring marriages happened appropriately.
And this is where the idea of kanyadana comes in, the gift of a daughter.
Yes, kanyadana, the gift of a daughter in marriage, became a significant religious duty for the father. It formalized the transfer of the daughter from her father's control and lineage to that of her husband.
That sounds like a system really designed to control women and ensure lineage continuity.
It certainly placed considerable constraints on women's autonomy regarding marriage and property. And this emphasis on rigid social codes seems to have intensified with the growth of new towns and urban centers from around the 6th century BCE.
Why did towns make things more complex for these social rules, more people mixing?
Exactly. Towns brought together people from diverse backgrounds, engaged in varied occupations from different regions, leading to greater social interaction and potentially the questioning of older localized practices.
So how did the Brahmanas, who were clearly keen on maintaining order, respond to this potential chaos?
Well, they responded by compiling these detailed codes of social behavior, the Dharma Sutras and later the Dharma Shastras. The most famous, of course, is the Manusmriti, probably compiled between 200 BCE and 200 CE. These texts, written in Sanskrit by and for Brahmanas, aim to provide a comprehensive blueprint for social order, covering everything: marriage, property, social hierarchy.
And they presented these rules as universally valid, like this is how everyone should live.
They did. They claimed their norms should be followed by everyone. However, the reality of a vast and diverse subcontinent meant their influence was uneven. Social relations were far more complex than the texts sometimes suggest.
And we can see hints of this complexity even within the Dharmashastras themselves, right? By their acknowledging multiple forms of marriage, not just the one ideal one.
Exactly. The Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras recognized as many as 8 forms of marriage. While the first 4 were deemed good or appropriate from the Brahmana perspective, the remaining 4 were often criticized or even condemned.
So the very act of listing the bad forms suggests they were being practiced out there.
It strongly indicates that alternative marriage practices existed in society, likely among groups who did not fully subscribe to Brahmana norms. Source 3 from the Manusmriti gives us examples of some of these.
Okay, let's look at the first form it lists. What's that one?
The first form is described as the gift of a daughter, after dressing her in costly clothes and honoring her with presents of jewels, to a man learned in the Veda whom the father himself invites.
Okay, that's clearly the Kanyadana ideal we talked about. The father is totally in control, gifting his daughter to a groom he picks.
Absolutely. The father is the main decision maker.
What about the fourth form mentioned?
The fourth is the gift of a daughter by the father after he has addressed the couple with the text, "May both of you perform your duties together," and has shown honor to the bridegroom. Again, the father is gifting the daughter, but it adds this element of emphasizing the couple's joint duties. Still very much the father's decision, though.
Right. Now the fifth form sounds different.
It is. The fifth is when the bridegroom receives a maiden after having given as much wealth as he can afford to the kinsman and to the bride herself, according to his own will.
Okay, this sounds like it involves an exchange of wealth, a kind of bride price, almost. Who's making the decision here? Is it the groom?
It appears to be more of a negotiation. The groom initiates the union by offering wealth to the bride's kinsman, maybe her father or brothers, and also to the bride herself. The kinsmen agree by accepting the wealth, so the impetus seems to rest on the groom's willingness and ability to pay. The bride's direct decision isn't the main focus, though she does receive wealth.
Interesting. And the sixth form, the voluntary union of a maiden and her lover, which springs from desire.
Now, this is a radical departure from the others, isn't it? It explicitly mentions voluntary union driven by desire between the maiden and her lover.
That sounds like marriage based on mutual choice, or maybe even elopement, completely bypassing the father's gift or the kinsman's arrangement.
Precisely. Here, the decision-making power rests squarely with the couple themselves. The fact that the Manusmriti describes this, even if it considers it less desirable, confirms that marriage is driven by personal choice and desire rather than just arranged by families, were a reality in society.
It really shows that tension between the ideal prescribed by the Brahmana texts and the actual diverse practices happening on the ground.
Absolutely. Another key Brahmana practice linked to lineage and purity, important from around 1000 BCE onwards, was the concept of Gotra. People, especially Brahmanas, were classified into these Gotras, named after ancient Vedic seers.
And there were two main rules regarding Gotra and marriage, weren't there?
Yes. First, a woman was expected to give up her father's Gotra upon marriage and adopt her husband's. Second, marriage within the same Gotra was prohibited. This was the rule of Gotra exogamy.
Right, marrying outside your own Gotra.
It reinforced the idea of marrying outside one's immediate ancestral lineage, as defined by the Gotra.
So how did historians check if these rules were actually followed, especially by powerful families who might claim high status but maybe played by their own rules?
Well, we can look at inscriptions from ruling dynasties, which sometimes provide clues. The Satavahana rulers in Western India and the Deccan, around the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, offer a really fascinating case study here.
Okay, the Satavahanas. What do their inscriptions reveal about Gotra rules?
Source 4 lists some names of Satavahana rulers. Many of them are identified by names ending in Puta, meaning son, in Prakrit. But what's striking is that the name preceding Puta is often the name of their mother.
Ah, like Gotami Puta, son of Gotami, and Vasiti Puta, son of Vasithi.
Exactly. And Gotami and Vasithi are the feminine forms of major Gotra names, Gotama and Vasista.
So these kings were using metronymics names derived from their mother, even though the lineage was generally patrilineal. That's interesting.
Yes. This practice of metronymics is also found in earlier texts, like the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which Source 4 also mentions in lists of teachers. But it's particularly prominent in the names of these Satavahana rulers.
Does using the mother's name mean the mother was a particularly important figure or held power?
It may suggest that mothers, particularly those from influential lineages themselves, implied by using the Gotra name, held significant status within the royal family. However, we need to be cautious. Succession to the throne was still generally patrilineal, passing from father to son. So acknowledging the mother's lineage through naming didn't necessarily translate into her holding political power herself.
Fair enough. But what about the Brahmana Gotra rules themselves? Did the Satavahanas follow those rules about changing the Gotra after marriage and marrying outside the Gotra?
Here's where we see a really significant deviation from the Brahmana norms. We know Satavahana rulers often practice polygyny, having multiple wives.
Right.
Their inscriptions reveal that their wives frequently retain their father's Gotra name, like Gutami, Vasista, after marriage, rather than adopting their husband's Gotra as prescribed by Brahmana rules.
Okay, so the first Gotra rule about adopting the husband's Gotra was often ignored by these high-status women. What about the rule of exogamy, not marrying within the same Gotra?
This is where it gets even more interesting. The evidence strongly suggests they did marry within the Gotra sometimes. It appears some Satavahana rulers married women belonging to the same Gotra.
Oh, really? Violating the exogamy rule.
Yes. This practice, endogamy marriage within the kin group or Gotra, was prevalent in certain communities, particularly in South India, and it served to keep the community close-knit.
So the Satavahanas, who claimed high status, even sometimes Brahmana status, like Gotami Puta Siri Satakani did,
Right, who called himself a unique Brahmana.
they were actively disregarding key Brahmana marriage rules regarding Gotra exogamy.
This is a crucial piece of evidence. It shows that Brahmana prescriptions were not universally followed, even by powerful ruling families. It highlights the existence of different, often regional marriage practices like endogamy, which coexisted with, and sometimes defied, the norms laid down in texts like the Dharmashastras.
That's a fascinating contradiction between the textual ideal and the documented reality. Let's look at another perspective on mothers within this society. Source 5 in the Mahabharata describes Gandhari's advice to her son Duryodhana just before the Great War.
Yes, this is a really poignant moment. As war is basically imminent, Gandhari, the mother of the Kauravas, makes this final, heartfelt plea to her eldest son Duryodhana. She appeals to him to avert the conflict and make peace with the Pandavas.
What arguments does she use to try and persuade him? Does she appeal to emotion, reason?
She appeals very much to his reason and long-term welfare. She tells him, essentially, that it's the wise man, the one in control of his senses, who guards his kingdom. She warns him that greed and anger drag a man away from his profits. By defeating these two enemies, a king conquers the earth.
So she links virtue and self-control to successful kingship.
Yes, and she explicitly argues that war brings no real benefit. She says, there's no good in a war, no law, dharma, and profit, artha, let alone happiness, nor is there necessarily victory in the end. Don't set your mind on war.
She presents peace as the path of dharma, artha, and happiness.
Exactly. Promising he could enjoy the earth happily alongside the Pandavas if he just chose that path.
But despite this wise counsel from his mother, Duryodhana ignores her completely.
Totally. He's driven by his anger and jealousy and just refuses to listen. And, of course, he ultimately loses everything in the war that follows.
What does this passage suggest about how mothers were viewed in this context? Respected but ultimately powerless.
Well, within this narrative, mothers like Gandhari are presented as figures who offer wise, ethical counsel. They seem to embody values like peace, foresight, the greater good dharma, artha, happiness. Gandhari's advice is clearly framed as correct and the path to avoid a disaster. But the fact that the powerful male figure, her son Duryodhana, can and does choose to disregard this counsel with such dire consequences might suggest that while maternal wisdom was perhaps respected in principle, it didn't necessarily translate into authority or guaranteed obedience in practice, so especially when confronted by strong male ambition and will.
It paints a picture of mothers as perhaps trusted advisors, embodying tradition, but whose influence is ultimately dependent on whether the men in power choose to listen. Thinking about names and lineage, you touched on metronymics earlier with the Satavahanas. How do these ancient naming conventions compare to how children are named today? It seems quite different.
Today, naming practices vary hugely by culture, don't they? But many global practices involve inheriting a father's surname, which is patrilineal, or sometimes combining parents' surnames. You also see teconyms in some cultures naming a parent after their child.
Right.
The ancient practices we've seen using patronymics, son of X, metronymic, son of Y, or associating people with ancient Gotra names show these different ways societies have formalized identity and lineage over time. They highlight how identity could be tied to ancestral lineage, the father's line, or even, as with the Satavahanas, incorporate the mother's lineage identity in a really prominent way, which feels less common in many modern surname systems today.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and delve into another fundamental aspect of social organization, caste, or Varna. This seems like one of the most significant ways social differences were structured in this period, and one that still resonates today.
It absolutely is. The concept of Varna refers to the system of 4 hierarchically ordered social categories described and promoted in texts like the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras.
And this order wasn't just social, it was presented as divinely ordained, wasn't it?
Yes. Brahmanical texts claimed this system was part of the fundamental cosmic order established right at the beginning of creation. They placed Brahmanas at the top, followed by Kshatriyas, then Vaishyas, and finally Shudras at the bottom. And a central tenet was that one's Varna was determined by birth and was largely unchangeable.
And specific occupations were prescribed for each Varna according to these texts, like a job description based on birth.
Yes, the Dharma Sutras and Dharma Shastras laid down ideal occupations for each group. We see this implicitly in Source 6. For Brahmanas, it was intellectual and religious pursuits, studying and teaching the Vedas, performing and getting sacrifices performed, and giving and receiving gifts.
Okay, the priests and scholars, and for the rulers and warriors.
Kshatriyas were assigned the roles of warfare, protecting the people, and administering justice. They were also allowed to study the Vedas, get sacrifices performed, and make gifts, sharing some activities with Brahmanas, but their core function was political and military power.
Right. What about the economic classes, like merchants and farmers? Where did they fit?
That was the role of the Vaishyas. They were assigned agriculture, pastoralism, herding, and trade. Like Kshatriyas, they were also allowed the last 3 activities: studying Vedas, getting sacrifices, making gifts. They were seen as the primary producers and wealth generators in the system.
And the Shudras at the bottom.
Shudras were assigned only one primary occupation, serving the 3 higher Varnas. That was their defined role.
So a very strict division of labor and status based on birth, justified by this divine origin story. How did the Brahmanas try to ensure this system was actually followed? It seems like it would be hard to enforce perfectly.
They employed several strategies. Firstly, as we mentioned, they asserted the divine origin of the Varna order. They frequently cited a specific verse from the Purusha Sukta hymn in the Rig Veda that's in source 6.
Ah, yes. This is the hymn describing the cosmic man's sacrifice creating the world.
Exactly. It describes the four Varnas as emanating from different parts of the primeval being, Purusha. The Brahmana from his mouth, the Kshatriya from his arms, the Vaishya from his thighs, and the Shudra from his feet.
That's a really powerful symbolic representation, linking social order to cosmic creation. Why would citing this hymn be so important for Brahmanas? What did it achieve for them?
Well, it provided this deep cosmic legitimacy for their position at the top and for the entire hierarchical structure. By linking the Varna order to the very act of creation, they made it seem natural, inevitable, and divinely sanctioned. It made it much harder to question or challenge its fundamental basis, you see.
Right, hard to argue with the structure of the universe itself. So, claiming divine origin was strategy one. What were the others?
Second, they sought to gain the support of kings and rulers. They advised rulers that it was their royal duty, their dharma, to uphold and enforce the Varna norms within their kingdoms. Kings were encouraged to punish those who deviated.
Get the state involved in enforcement.
Exactly. And third, they attempted to persuade people that their status and destiny were inherently linked to their birth, that this was just the way things were and should be.
But as we've seen, persuasion and prescription weren't always enough, were they? How else were these norms reinforced? Maybe through stories.
Often through stories, yes, embedded within texts like the Mahabharata. These narratives serve not only to entertain, but also to transmit social values and illustrate the potential consequences of challenging the established order.
The story of Drona and Ekalavya comes to mind immediately. That feels like a key example.
It's a poignant and really powerful illustration of this, absolutely. That's source 7. Drona was the esteemed Brahmana teacher of archery and warfare to the Kuru princes, the elites. Ekalavya was a forest-dwelling Nishada.
Someone outside the main four Varnas, usually seen as low status.
Right. Ekalavya wants to learn from the very best, so he approaches Drona seeking tutelage. But Drona refuses him. The text explicitly states Drona knew the Dharma, implying his refusal was in accordance with the social norms or restrictions that limited who could be taught certain skills, especially high-status martial skills, to uphold the Varna hierarchy.
That's a clear instance of Varna preventing access to opportunity right there, but Ekalavya doesn't give up, does he?
No, he's incredibly determined. He goes back to his forest, makes a clay image of Drona, and practices archery relentlessly, treating the image as his guru. Through his sheer dedication and self-training, he becomes an archer of absolutely unparalleled skill, potentially even surpassing Arjuna, who was Drona's favorite student, and to whom Drona had promised he would be the best archer in the world.
And then the Pandavas stumble upon him by chance.
Yes, while hunting, their dog wanders off and starts barking at Ekalavya. Ekalavya silences the dog by shooting 7 arrows into its mouth without injuring it, an astonishing feat of archery that just astounds the Pandavas. They track him down, and he identifies himself as Drona's pupil.
And Arjuna, Drona's star pupil, gets worried and reminds Drona of his promise.
Right. So Drona then goes to Ekalavya. Ekalavya immediately pays homage, acknowledging Drona as his master.
Yeah.
And Drona then demands his guru dakshina, the traditional teacher's fee.
And he asks for Ekalavya's right thumb, the crucial thumb for archery.
Yes. The very thumb essential for drawing a bowstring powerfully and accurately. And Ekalavya, without hesitation, cuts off his thumb and offers it to Drona.
And the result is that Ekalavya loses his superior skill, ensuring Arjuna remains the best.
Correct. With the loss of his thumb, Ekalavya's archery skill is fundamentally diminished, thus ensuring that Arjuna remains unrivaled, just as Drona had promised.
That's such a brutal story, especially from Ekalavya's perspective. What message was the story intended to convey, particularly about the Varna system? It feels quite pointed.
The source prompts us to consider this, and it's complex. From a perspective strictly adhering to the Dharma Sutras, Drona's initial refusal might have been seen as him upholding Dharma, maintaining the boundaries between Varnas and jatis. But the outcome is chilling, isn't it?
Absolutely. What message does it send to people like the Nishadas or anyone deemed low status who might aspire to something?
It sends a powerful and perhaps intentionally intimidating message that your potential and skill are ultimately limited by your birth status. Even extraordinary talent and dedication can be suppressed by those in power, like the Brahmana teacher Drona, who uphold the system. It implies that merit from those outside the accepted framework is actually dangerous and must be neutralized to protect the position of those within.
And to Kshatriyas like Arjuna, what's the message for them?
It reinforces their privileged position. It suggests that their superiority, their excellence, is not solely dependent on their own effort, but also on the actions of those who maintain the social order and actively prevent others from rising above their station. Their status is, in a sense, protected by the system itself, by actions like Dronas. This story, though tragic for Ekalavya, functions within the epic as a narrative that really reinforces the idea of birth-based restrictions and the power dynamic inherent in the Varna system.
But as we keep seeing, the reality of social mobility and power didn't always align perfectly with these prescriptions, did it? The Shastras might say only Kshatriyas can be kings, but history shows otherwise.
Absolutely. You mentioned instances of non-Kshatriya rulers earlier.
Yeah.
For example, the social origin of the Mauryas, who built this vast empire, is still debated. Some texts call them Kshatriyas, others say they were of low origin. But there's no debate at all about the Shungas and Kanvas, who immediately succeeded the Mauryas. They were Brahmanas who became kings.
So Brahmana kingship was a historical reality, flying in the face of the rule that kings should be Kshatriyas.
Yes. It clearly shows that actual political power often rested on factors like military strength, administrative skill, the ability to gather resources and support, rather than strictly on Kshatriya birth as prescribed.
And what about outsiders? People completely outside the Varna system, like the Shakas from Central Asia.
The Shakas were explicitly labeled mechas by Brahmanas, seen as barbarians or outsiders. Yet, we have powerful Shaka rulers like Rudradaman around the 2nd century CE. His impressive Sanskrit inscription, Source 8, includes a coin of his describing the repair of the Sujana lake, demonstrates a clear engagement with and adoption of Sanskritic traditions, even while they were considered outside the normative framework.
So they were powerful outsiders who adopted some of the high cultural practices of the region they came to rule.
Exactly. And let's revisit the Satavahana ruler, Gautamiputra Siri Satakani. He provides another layer of complexity to this whole idea of Varna and status.
Right, he claimed to be a unique Brahmana and a destroyer of Kshatriya pride, which is already a contradiction.
It's fascinatingly contradictory within the Brahmana framework, where kings are ideally Kshatriyas and Brahmanas are supposed to be distinct from them, not claiming to destroy their pride. Furthermore, he claimed to prevent intermarriage among the Varnas, thereby positioning himself as upholding the fourfold order.
But then, he entered into a marriage alliance with the kin of Rudradaman, the Shaka ruler, who was considered a malecha.
Precisely. This demonstrates the incredibly complex process of social integration and negotiation happening. Here is a king claiming high Brahmana status, even while ruling a Kshatriya role, asserting his role in upholding the Varna order by preventing intermarriage among the 4 Varnas, yet simultaneously forming alliances through marriage with people considered explicitly outside that Varna system by the very texts he seems to reference.
Wow.
Add to this the Satavahana's practice of endogamy marrying within Gotra that contradicted Brahmana exogamy rules, and you see this dynamic process of claiming status, adopting some norms, disregarding others, and integrating with different groups. It was not a neat system.
It's a picture of a constantly negotiated social landscape, not a fixed grid.
Absolutely. These complexities extend to the concept of jati as well. Jati, like Varna, was theoretically based on birth in the Brahmanical system. But unlike the fixed 4 Varnas, there was no limit to the number of jatis.
So jati was a more flexible category, used for groups that didn't fit the 4 main boxes.
Yes, exactly. It was used to classify new groups that didn't fit neatly into the 4 Varnas. This could include forest-dwelling communities like the Nishadas or specific occupational groups like goldsmiths, suvarnakara, or weavers. Jati became a way to categorize the myriad diverse communities and occupational groups found across the subcontinent.
And people within the same jati sometimes formed guilds or shrenas based on their occupation.
Yes. We have very few records directly from these groups, unfortunately, but the Mandasaurus stone inscription from the 5th century CE is a really valuable exception. It records the history of a guild of silk weavers.
Okay. What does that inscription tell us about their social life? Were they just about weaving?
It recounts how this guild of silk weavers migrated from Lata in Gujarat all the way to Mandsaur in Madhya Pradesh. And crucially, they are described as migrating with their children and kinfolk.
So the guild wasn't just an economic association, it was a whole community moving together, probably a jati.
That's the implication. They were a community based on their craft. But the inscription provides fascinating detail that really complicates the idea of fixed, birth-based occupations. While their primary craft was silk weaving, The inscription notes that some members of the guild adopted other occupations or pursued really diverse interests.
Source 8 gives a list of these diverse activities, doesn't it? It's quite surprising.
It mentions members intensely attached to music, others conversant with biographies and wonderful tales, some absorbed in religious discourses, others excelling in their own religious rites, some mastering Vedic astronomy, and some even valorous in battle.
Music, literature, religion, science, warfare. That's an incredibly broad range of activities for a group supposedly defined by the single craft of silk weaving.
It really is. And this inscription prompts us to question, were these silk weavers strictly adhering to the occupations prescribed by the Shastras? If they were classified as a certain jati, or even Shudras based on their craft, their engagement in these diverse activities, some of which overlap with prescribed roles of higher Varnas, like Vedic astronomy for Brahmanas or battle for Kshatriyas, demonstrates that real-life occupations and interests were much more fluid than the rigid Varna system suggests.
It shows people weren't necessarily confined to doing just one thing based on their birth or their main craft.
Exactly. And it also shows their collective identity and agency. The inscription records that they collectively decided to use their wealth, earned through their craft, to build a magnificent temple to the sun god. This highlights their shared identity as a community beyond their individual skills or occupations, and their ability to undertake large collective projects.
What about merchants specifically? Were they always Vaishyas?
Well, the term Vanik is used for merchants in Sanskrit texts and inscriptions. And while the Shastras generally assign trade to Vaishyas, again, we find examples that challenge this rigid categorization.
Like who? Any specific examples?
In the play Richakatika, probably from around the 4th century CE, by Shudraka the hero, Charudatta, is described as a Brahmana who's also a Satavahana, a merchant.
A Brahmana engaging in trade, that directly contradicts the prescribed roles.
It does. And a 5th century inscription mentions two brothers who made a donation for a temple and are described as Kshatriya Vaniks,
Kshatriya merchants.
suggesting they were Kshatriyas who were also involved in trade.
So the reality was that members of different Varnas could and did engage in trade, even though the Shastras assigned it primarily to Vaishyas.
These examples from plays and inscriptions really underscore that the actual social landscape was far more complex and dynamic than the idealized Varna framework described in the prescriptive texts. Economic roles and activities often cut across the strict boundaries of Varna, and people's lives encompassed diverse skills and occupations.
Beyond the Varnas and jatis that the texts attempted to categorize, there are also entire populations considered outside this framework altogether, right? People who just didn't fit in.
Yes, absolutely. The Indian subcontinent was home to a vast array of diverse communities. Many groups whose social practices, languages, or livelihoods differed significantly from the settled agrarian norms promoted by Brahmanical traditions were often perceived as being outside the Varna system.
And how are these groups typically described in the Sanskrit texts written by the Brahmanas? Probably not very flatteringly.
Often negatively, yes. They were sometimes described as odd, uncivilized, or even animal-like. It really highlights the perspective of the authors who viewed them through the lens of their own norms. These included forest dwellers, like the Nishadas we talked about with Ekalavya, who relied on hunting and gathering, or nomadic pastoralists, whose mobile lifestyle was difficult to fit into a society based on settled agriculture.
And people speaking different languages.
Those who spoke non-Sanskrit languages were sometimes labeled meleches, a term often carrying connotations of being foreign or culturally other.
So anyone who didn't conform to the dominant cultural or social patterns was potentially viewed with suspicion and described negatively. But despite these negative descriptions, was there still interaction, sharing of ideas, or were they completely separate worlds?
No, there was definitely interaction and exchange, even with groups depicted negatively. The nature of these interactions is sometimes hinted at in stories within the Mahabharata itself.
The story of Bhima and Hidimba comes to mind again here. She was a Rakshasi, right?
She was, source 9. When the Pandavas are in exile in the forest, Bhima encounters Hidimba. She's described as a Rakshasi, and initially she's sent by her man-eating Rakshasa brother to capture the Pandavas. But instead of fulfilling her mission, Hidimba sees Bhima and falls in love with him on the spot.
And she transforms herself into a beautiful maiden to approach him.
Right. She proposes to Bhima, who initially refuses. Meanwhile, her brother arrives, challenges Bhima, and Bhima kills him in a fierce battle.
So she falls for him, he kills her brother. Still quite the dramatic setup for a romance.
Indeed. Despite all this, Hidimba declares her love and devotion to Kunti, the Pandava's mother, saying something like, I have forsaken my friends, my dharma and my kin, and good lady, chosen your tiger-like son for my man. She explicitly states she's leaving behind her previous identity and social ties for Bhima.
And Kunti and Yudhishthira actually agree to the union, but with conditions.
Yes, Yudhishthira, always the rule follower, allows Bhima to marry Hidimba on the condition that Bhima spends the day with her wherever she desires, but returns to the Pandavas' camp every night. They have a son, Ghatotkacha, who is described as a Rakshasa, but fiercely loyal to his Pandava kin. He promises to return whenever needed and plays a crucial role later in the war.
Historians suggest that Rakshasa might have been a term used in texts to describe people or communities whose practices were significantly different from Brahmana norms. What non-Brahmanical practices are hinted at in this story?
Several elements stand out that suggest different norms. Hidimba's ability to change form challenges the idea of fixed identities. Her brother, being a man-eater, is certainly outside settled civilized norms. The union itself between a human hero and the being described as a Rakshasi, even in human form, represents an intergroup relationship that would likely be frowned upon, if not forbidden, in texts emphasizing purity and separation.
Right.
And Hidimba, forsaking her own dharma and kin for Bhima, also shows a kind of fluid approach to social ties compared to the rigid adherence expected in normative texts.
So the story, while fantastical, maybe hints at the existence of groups with very different ways of life and the possibility of interaction and even integration, albeit filtered through the epic's narrative lens and maybe using Rakshasa as a label for otherness.
It portrays a world with different rules and beings, and shows how those perceived as other could still be incorporated into the central narrative, sometimes demonized, sometimes forming alliances or family ties. It reflects the complex relationship between the settled, text-focused society and the diverse communities living around and among them.
While some groups were simply described negatively or as other, Brahmanas also created a much sharper social divide based on notions of ritual purity, didn't they? Resulting in the concept of untouchability.
This is a profound and deeply damaging social division. Certain activities, particularly those involving contact with death or bodily fluids, things like handling corpses or working with dead animals, were considered polluting. Those who performed these essential tasks were deemed ritually impure and classified as chandalas, placed at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy.
And the pollution was considered so extreme that even their touch, or sometimes even just their sight, was considered contaminating by higher status groups.
Yes, by those claiming high status and ritual purity. This led to extreme forms of social exclusion, segregation, and discrimination.
What kind of lives were prescribed for chandalas in texts like the Manusmriti? It sounds horrific.
The Manusmriti laid down incredibly harsh, dehumanizing rules for chandalas. They were forced to live outside the main village or city. They had to use only discarded utensils, wear clothes taken from the dead, and adorn themselves with iron ornaments.
Wow.
They were forbidden from walking in villages or cities after dark. Their assigned tasks included disposing of the bodies of those without relatives and serving as executioners. It was a life of enforced degradation and marginalization.
That is just grim. Do we have any evidence from sources outside the Brahmana text that backs this up? Did travelers notice this?
Yes, unfortunately, accounts from travelers who visited India during this period largely corroborate these descriptions. The Chinese Buddhist monk Faxian, who was in India in the 5th century CE, recorded that untouchables had to announce their presence by sounding a clapper when entering the streets of a market or town.
So others could avoid coming near them.
Precisely. And another Chinese pilgrim, Xuanzang, visiting in the 7th century, observed that scavengers and executioners were indeed forced to live outside the city limits. These external accounts, written from a different cultural perspective, confirm that the social exclusion and harsh conditions described in the Brahmana texts for groups like chandalas were, to a significant extent, reflected in the lived reality of the time.
So the grim picture painted by the Manusmriti seems to align depressingly well with external observations. But were there any alternative views, any hints of different realities or challenges to this system for chandalas?
Yes, importantly, other traditions sometimes offered different perspectives or presented narratives that challenged the Brahmana view. The Matanga Jataka, a Pali Buddhist text, is a prime example of this. That's source 10.
Okay, the Matanga Jataka, what's the story there?
This is a story from a previous life of the Bodhisattva, the being who will eventually become the Buddha. In this particular life, he is born as Matanga, the son of a Chandala living outside the city of Benares. One day he enters the city and happens to cross paths with Ditha Mangalika, the beautiful daughter of a wealthy merchant.
And how does she react to encountering a Chandala? Predictably badly.
Her reaction perfectly illustrates the pollution beliefs. Upon seeing him, she cries out that she has seen something inauspicious and immediately washes her eyes to purify herself. Her attendants then beat Matanga up.
Good grief, a clear demonstration of the social prejudice and violence associated with untouchability.
Right. But Matanga doesn't just accept this, he protests. He lies down at the merchant's doorstep for 7 days, refusing to move. On the 7th day, the merchant family, perhaps shamed or pressured, gives Ditha Mangalika to him. She takes the starving Matanga back to the Chandala settlement.
So despite the immense social barriers, he actually ends up marrying a woman from a much higher status group. That's already a huge challenge to the norms.
It is, and the story continues. Matanga renounces the world and attains great spiritual powers through meditation. He returns to Benares and marries Ditha Mangalika properly. They have a son, Mandavya Kumara, who becomes highly educated, mastering the 3 Vedas, and grows up to be a respected figure who feeds 16,000 Brahmanas daily.
So their son becomes completely integrated into the Brahmana elite, despite his father's origins.
Yes. But then one day, Matanga, still wearing his simple, perhaps ragged clothes from his ascetic life, comes begging at his own son Mandavya's house during one of these feasts. Mandavya, surrounded by the Brahmanas he is feeding, doesn't recognize his father and is appalled that someone looking like an outcast would dare come seeking alms meant for the pure Brahman. He calls Matanga an outcast, unworthy of such charity.
Oh, wow. So the son, having become a respected Brahmana, has completely adopted the very prejudices his father was born into. The irony.
Exactly. But Matanga responds with this incredibly powerful critique of the Brahmana value system. He argues, those who are proud of their birth and are ignorant do not deserve gifts. On the contrary, those who are free from vices are worthy of offerings.
He's directly challenging the idea that status, worthiness, or purity comes from birth or ritual. He's arguing for a spiritual or ethical basis for worthiness instead.
Precisely. He's subverting the core Brahmana claim that birth determines status and purity. Mandavya, enraged by this challenge to his worldview and status, tries to have him thrown out. But Matanga, using his spiritual powers, flies into the air and disappears.
And the story ends with Ditha Mangalika, the mother, seeking forgiveness and sharing food from Matanga's own begging bowl with her son and the Brahmanas, implying that the food from the spiritually powerful Chandala is indeed worthy.
This story, coming from a Buddhist text, offers a clear and potent counterpoint to the Brahmana narrative about Chandalas. Matanga, the Chandala, is the bodhisattva, the spiritual hero. He's capable of marrying into a higher group, achieving spiritual enlightenment, and directly critiquing the pride and birth-based hierarchy of the Brahmanas. It demonstrates that alternative religious and social perspectives existed that fundamentally challenged the Brahmana Varna system and the concept of untouchability, highlighting that spiritual attainment and ethical conduct, not birth, were the true measures of a person's worth.
It's a powerful piece of evidence showing resistance and alternative ways of thinking about social order. We've talked about status based on birth, Varnajati and its limitations. What about status based purely on economic resources? How much did wealth matter?
Access to wealth and resources played a significant role, absolutely. It shaped social positions across different groups, from slaves and landless laborers right up to wealthy merchants and kings. Economic power often intersected with, and sometimes even challenged, the birth-based hierarchy we've been discussing.
And access to resources wasn't equal, particularly between men and women, was it?
That's a crucial point. The Mahabharata's infamous dice game, Source 11, vividly illustrates the precarious position of women regarding property and control. As Yudhishthira gambles away everything, his wealth, property, his kingdom, his brothers, and even himself, he then stakes and loses Draupadi, their common wife.
And Draupadi poses that fundamental, devastating question. Had Yudhishthira already lost himself, become a slave before he staked her? Could a slave stake anything?
Exactly. This question goes right to the heart of whether a man who no longer had ownership or control over his own person could still exercise ownership or control over another person, specifically his wife. The text presents conflicting opinions being debated fiercely by the assembled kings and elders.
What were those conflicting views? How did they argue it?
Well, one view argued that even if Yudhishthira was no longer free, his wife remained under his control like property, and therefore he still had the right to stake her.
Suggesting she was treated essentially as a possession subject to the husband's control, regardless of his own status.
That seems to be the implication of that argument. The opposing view, however, argued that a man who was not free himself, who was essentially property himself, could not possibly stake another person. How can a possession possess something else?
This suggests a view where a wife's status was not entirely equivalent to that of mere property, or at least her husband's loss of freedom impacted his rights over her.
Right. The text actually leaves the matter unresolved within the assembly, highlighting the ambiguity and perhaps the deep tension around this issue. It's only resolved later when King Dhritarashtra intervenes and grants the Pandavas and Draupadi their freedom back. But the debate itself confirms that while the idea of wives being under the husband's control like property was certainly present, it was also questioned.
What did the legal texts like the Manusmriti say about property inheritance generally? Did they align with the wife as property idea?
According to the Manusmriti, the paternal estate, the father's property, was generally divided equally among the sons after the parent's death. The eldest son often received a special, larger share. Daughters, within this framework, generally did not have a claim to a share of the paternal property.
So inheritance strongly favored sons, reinforcing Patriliny in the economic sphere as well. But women weren't completely without property of their own.
No, they weren't entirely excluded. Women were permitted to keep gifts they received specifically at the time of their marriage. This was known as stratana, literally woman's wealth.
And they had control over the stratana. Could the husband just take it?
Stratana was generally considered her own wealth. Her husband could not claim it without her consent under normal circumstances, and it could be inherited directly by her children, bypassing his lineage. However, the Manusmriti also included provisions that underscored male control over female property, warning women against hoarding family property or even their own valuables without their husband's permission. So even with stratana, their economic autonomy was somewhat circumscribed by the husband's authority.
So despite rare examples like Queen Prabhavati Gupta, who clearly exercised significant power and controlled land, the overall picture from texts and inscriptions seems to be that major resources like land, cattle, and significant monetary wealth were primarily controlled by men.
That's the general conclusion drawn by historians, yes. This difference in access to and control over economic resources was a major factor in sharpening social differences between men and women in this period.
Source 12 lists the ways men and women could acquire wealth according to the Manusmriti. Let's compare those lists. What could men do?
For men, the Manusmriti lists 7 means of acquiring wealth: inheritance, finding treasure; purchase, conquest through warfare; investment, work, or performance of work; and accepting gifts from good people.
That's a pretty broad spectrum, isn't it? From inheriting and just finding things to active engagement in the economy through purchase, investment, work, and even military action like conquest.
Exactly. It covers a wide range of activities. Now, for women, it lists 6 means. What was given before the marriage fire, nuptial gifts; gifts received during the bridal procession, a token of affection, given as a mark of love, maybe by the husband; what she received from her brother, mother, or father; any subsequent gifts received after marriage; and whatever her affectionate husband might give her.
The women's list seems much more focused on gifts and resources acquired from within the family or through familial connections, particularly centered around the event of marriage itself.
It is. The key difference is that the men's list includes these active external methods like conquest, investment, and work as broader categories reflecting their expected roles in public life and the wider economy. Women's means are almost entirely centered around gifts received from male family members or the husband, and gifts associated with the marriage ceremony itself. While gifts appear on both lists, the scope and nature of wealth acquisition methods described really reflect and reinforce the gendered division of roles and access to resources presented in the text.
So the legal text clearly reinforced gender differences in economic opportunity and control. And the Varna system also attempted to regulate access to wealth, didn't it, based on those prescribed occupations?
In theory, yes. The prescribed occupations for each Varna implied differential access to resources. Shudras were limited to servitude, while Vaishyas were associated with trade and agriculture, potential wealth generation, and Brahmanas and Kshatriyas with roles receiving gifts, administration, warfare that could potentially involve significant wealth accumulation. The expectation in Brahmana texts is certainly that Brahmanas and Kshatriyas should hold the most wealth and status.
Although reality, as we've seen, might differ. Textual descriptions often show wealthy kings and generally rich priests, though sometimes poor Brahmanas are mentioned too.
Right, the ideal versus the reality. And again, not everyone accepted this system or its implications for wealth. Early Buddhism, as we discussed, offered a significant critique.
Yes, they challenged the Varna order based on birth. Did they also challenge the link between Varna and wealth?
Yes, they did. While they acknowledged social differences existed, they argued these were not divinely ordained or immutable, and often pointed to economic factors as the real drivers of status. This is powerfully illustrated in Source 13, a dialogue from the Majjhima Nikaya, a Pali Buddhist text, between King Avantaputta and Kachana, one of the Buddha's disciples.
Okay, what does the king say first in this dialogue?
King Avantaputta basically summarizes the core Brahmana claims we discussed earlier, that Brahmanas are the best caste, others are low, Brahmanas are fair, others dark, Brahmanas alone are pure, and that they are the legitimate sons of Brahma, born from his mouth, created by him, his heirs. All the usual justifications.
He lays out all the key Brahmana arguments for their superiority based on divine origin and birth. Standard stuff.
Right, and then Kachana responds by completely shifting the ground, asking about economic reality. He asks the king, what if a Shudra were wealthy, like really rich, possessing lots of corn, gold, silver, what would happen then? Would other Shudras, or even Kshatriyas, Brahmanas or Vaishyas, serve him obediently?
He's asking if cold, hard cash trumps birth status in actual social interactions.
Exactly. Does money talk louder than Varna? And King Avantaputta, based on his experience of the world, has to concede the point. He replies that yes, if a Shudra had wealth, he could command the service and polite deference of people from all four Varnas. They would get up before him, go to rest after him, carry out his orders, speak politely to him. The works.
So, in the face of significant wealth, the prescribed hierarchy of social interaction completely breaks down. Money overrides birth.
It does, according to the king's own admission, and based on this concession, Kachana poses the crucial question. This being so, are not these four Varnas exactly the same? Meaning, aren't the real determinants of how you were treated in society related to your wealth and power, not your supposed birth status?
And the king agrees. There was no difference amongst the Varnas on this count. Wow.
This text is just a brilliant Buddhist critique of the Brahmana-Varna system. It argues that the Brahmana claims of superiority based on divine origin, inherent purity, and birth are fundamentally contradicted by the observable reality of economic power. From this Buddhist perspective, it is wealth and access to resources that are the true drivers of social difference and influence, not one's Varna status by birth.
It's a very pragmatic, reality-based challenge to the idealistic birth-based system promoted by the Brahmanas. So we've seen status linked to birth and status linked to wealth. Were there any other significant ways status was understood or achieved in early Indian societies? Any alternative models?
Yes, there were other possibilities, especially maybe in regions where Brahmanical influence was less dominant in shaping the earliest textual traditions. Ancient Tamilakam, the land of Tamil-speaking peoples in South India, particularly during the period of chiefdoms around 2,000 years ago, offers a different perspective. Here, status seems to have derived significantly from generosity.
Status from giving things away, that seems almost counterintuitive compared to accumulating wealth for yourself.
It does from a modern perspective, maybe. But the Tamil Sangam poems from this period highlight a society where chiefs were incredibly important patrons of bards and poets who sang their praises and spread their fame. While wealth certainly existed, those who controlled resources, the chiefs, were under a strong social expectation to share their wealth, particularly with the bards who were crucial for their reputation.
So generosity was a key marker of a chief's status. How generous you were determined how great you were seen to be.
Absolutely. A chief's greatness wasn't just measured by how much wealth he amassed, but by how freely he distributed it, especially to the poets who would then immortalize his name in song. Source 14, a poem from the Puranaru anthology, illustrates this beautifully.
Okay, tell us about that poem. What does it describe?
A bard is describing his patron, a chief, to other poets, trying to encourage them to visit him. He portrays the chief as someone who isn't necessarily rolling in wealth every single day, perhaps precisely because he's so generous, but crucially, he's never petty enough to refuse those in need. The bard says something like, he, the patron, doesn't have the wealth to lavish on others every day, nor does he have the pettiness to say that he has nothing and so refuse.
He doesn't always have it, but he'll never turn you away empty-handed. A relatable problem for a generous person.
Exactly. The bard praises him explicitly for his open-handedness, calling him an enemy to the hunger of bards. It's great praise.
And how does the bard suggest the chief will get wealth if he's currently lacking it, so he can continue being generous?
This is the really fascinating part, revealing the link between generosity and another source of status. The bard encourages the other poets by saying, essentially, if we go to him and show him how hungry we are, he won't just shrug. He'll go straight to the village blacksmith and say, shape me a long spear for war, one that has a straight blade.
So the strategy to acquire wealth for sharing is warfare. Go out and get loot to distribute.
Exactly. The poem reveals a social model where the chief's status is based on his generosity, and his ability to be generous is directly linked to his martial prowess and his capacity to acquire resources through conquest or raiding. It's a model where status isn't just from birth or static wealth, but from this dynamic process of acquiring wealth through military means and then distributing it generously, particularly to those who sing your praises.
That's a really different perspective on social status compared to the Varna system or simply accumulating wealth. It's status earned through martial action and validated through generosity.
It highlights the regional diversity in how social hierarchies and values were constructed. In Tamilakam, at this specific time, being a generous warrior chief appears to have been a primary path to high status, perhaps alongside or even overriding birth in some contexts.
Fascinating. We've relied heavily on the Mahabharata throughout this discussion. How do historians actually approach such a monumental and complex text when they're trying to understand history? You can't just read it like a novel.
No, absolutely not. As we touched on early on, historians don't take it at face value. They apply critical methods. They analyze the language it's written in. Is it simple Sanskrit, suggesting a wider audience, or complex Vedic Sanskrit or technical language? They consider the text's type. Is it narrative, telling stories, or didactic, laying down rules?
Trying to separate the story from the sermon, essentially.
Yeah, though sometimes they're deeply intertwined. They try to understand the perspective of the authors or redactors, that their social position, like Brahmanas, their beliefs, their intentions, and who the intended audience might have been. And crucially, they attempt to date the different layers of the text's composition, because we know it evolved over centuries.
And only after all this critical analysis do they then try to use the text to inform their understanding of history.
Precisely. For a text as layered and complex as the Mahabharata, this process is particularly challenging but absolutely essential to understand its historical significance as both a product of its time and a powerful shaper of ideas for centuries afterwards.
The language you mentioned suggests it was meant for a relatively wide audience, not just scholars.
Yes, the Sanskrit is generally simpler than very early Vedic texts, or later, highly technical philosophical or grammatical Sanskrit. This suggests it was accessible, perhaps through recitation or performance, to a broader range of people than just a small priestly elite. This made it a really powerful vehicle for transmitting social and cultural ideas across society.
And the split between narrative and didactic sections, the stories versus the rules.
Historians generally view the core of the epic as a dramatic story, the narrative parts. The extensive didactic sections containing advice on social norms, politics, ethics, philosophy, these were largely added later, over time. While there's certainly overlap, the consensus is the epic was fundamentally a dynamic tale that accumulated layers of lessons and prescriptions as it grew.
The text itself is called itihasa, which is often translated as history. Do historians actually believe the Great War described in the epic was a real historical event?
That's a long-standing debate, and there's no easy answer. Itihasa literally means something like, thus it was, which could imply history, or it could simply mean a traditional account, the way things were told. Some historians think the epic might preserve the memory of a real, significant conflict between related groups, perhaps kin-based groups, from that early period.
A kernel of truth buried in the epic scale.
Perhaps. But others are more cautious. They point out the lack of independent, corroborating archaeological or textual evidence on the massive scale described in the epic. It's very hard to definitively prove the war as a specific historical event exactly as depicted.
So we can't say for sure it's a historical record of that particular war. What about the authorship? We know it wasn't one person sitting down and writing it.
Right. It's a process over centuries. The earliest versions were likely oral compositions by sutos. These were charioteer bards who traveled with warriors and recounted their deeds, celebrating their victories. Oral tradition first.
Okay.
Then, from around the 5th century BCE, Brahmanas began to take over the process, writing down and reshaping these stories. This coincides roughly with the emergence of larger kingdoms from earlier chiefdoms in the regions where the epic is set, like the Kuu kingdom. Perhaps there was a need to record or legitimize these new state formations with their own itihasa.
And it continued to grow even after being written down.
Yes, significantly.
Yeah.
A major phase of additions occurred between roughly 200 BCE and 200 CE. This coincided with the growing importance of Vishnu worship and Krishna's identification with Vishnu, who becomes a central figure in the epic.
Ah, the religious layer.
Exactly.
Right.
And then between around 200 and 400 CE, huge sections on dharma, politics, and social norms, very similar in content and tone to the Manusmriti, were added, vastly expanding the text.
Taking it from maybe less than 10,000 verses originally to its current size of over 100,000 verses.
Exactly. So while tradition attributes the entire work to the sage Vyasa, this really masks the centuries of additions, reinterpretations, and multiple hands involved in its composition and transmission. The text itself becomes a historical record of these evolving ideas and concerns over a millennium.
Can archaeology shed any light on the world described in the epic? For instance, Hastinapura, the Kuru capital. Has anyone tried to dig there?
Archaeologists have certainly looked for evidence to connect with the epic narrative. B.B. Long's excavations at a site identified as Hastinapura in Uttar Pradesh back in the 1950s were explicitly aimed at exploring this link. The site's location in the traditional heartland of the Kuru kingdom made it a plausible candidate for the epic's capital.
Okay, so Lal dug at Hastinapura. What did his excavations actually reveal about the settlement there? What did it look like in the relevant period?
Well, for the period potentially linked to the epic's main story setting, Lal called this Phase 2, dated roughly 12th to 7th centuries BCE, he found evidence of a settlement with houses made of mud and mud brick walls. Some walls seem to be made of reeds plastered with mud.
Mud huts, essentially.
Relatively simple structures, yes. In a later layer, Phase 3, dated roughly 6th to 3rd centuries BCE, he found structures with mud brick and, importantly, burnt bricks, along with more complex urban features like soakage jars and brick drains for sanitation, and terracotta ring wells, which could be wells or drainage pits. So a more developed settlement later on.
Okay, now let's compare those findings, especially from the earlier period, to how the Mahabharata describes Hastinapura in Source 15. The epic paints a grand picture, doesn't it?
It really does. The epic describes the city in incredibly grand terms. Bursting like the ocean, packed with hundreds of mansions, displayed with its gateways, arches, and turrets like massing clouds, the splendor of great Indra's city. It sounds magnificent.
Does Lal's archaeological evidence from that earlier period, the mud walls and red plaster, match this description of hundreds of mansions and gateways like clouds?
Source 16 prompts us to consider this directly, and the honest answer is not really. The Phase 2 archaeological finds suggest a relatively modest settlement compared to the epic's incredibly grand and elaborate depiction of a city overflowing with mansions and ornate architecture.
So there's a clear discrepancy between the archaeological evidence for the likely time period and the epic's description of the city.
There is. And this discrepancy raises questions, obviously. Was the description of Hastinapura in the epic added much later, perhaps during or after Phase 3, after the 6th century BCE, when urban centers in the region did develop more elaborate architectural features and might have more closely resembled the epic's portrayal? Or was the description simply a flight of poetic fancy? An idealized, perhaps exaggerated portrayal typical of epic literature, not intended as a literal architectural blueprint and therefore not necessarily verifiable by archaeology.
Right.
It really highlights the difficulty of using creative literature as direct evidence for material history.
It reminds us again that the epic is primarily a story, a poem, not an objective historical or architectural record. Let's turn to another really challenging episode that historians analyze carefully. Draupadi's marriage to all 5 Pandava brothers. Polyandry.
Yes, this is one of the most discussed and debated episodes in the entire epic. It represents a central instance of polyandry, a woman having multiple husbands within the narrative.
Walk us through that story again from Source 16. How does this unusual marriage come about?
Okay, so to win Draupadi's hand, her father, King Drupada, holds a very difficult archery contest. Arjuna, disguised at the time, succeeds in hitting the target. Draupadi garlands him, indicating he is her chosen husband. When the 5 Pandavas return home to their temporary dwelling, they tell their mother Kunti, "Look what we've brought," thinking of alms perhaps. Without looking, Kunti tells them to share it equally amongst themselves, as they always shared everything.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. When she sees Draupadi, she realizes her unintentional command, but states that her word, given with a pure heart, cannot be violated or taken aback.
So based purely on their mother's accidental command, the 5 brothers decide to share Draupadi as their common wife. That seems drastic.
Yes. Yudhishthira, the eldest and most devoted to Dharma and his mother's word, makes the decision. King Drupada, Draupadi's father, is understandably horrified and protests this highly unconventional arrangement, which goes completely against the prevailing norms of marriage he knows. To resolve the situation and convince Drupada, the wise sage Vyasa, who, remember, is traditionally considered the composer-compiler of the epic and also related to the family, is brought in.
And Vyasa provides justifications for this unusual marriage. He explains it away.
He offers multiple explanations, interestingly. One is mythological. He reveals that the Pandavas are actually partial incarnations of the deity Indra, and Draupadi was, in a previous life, Indra's wife, or an aspect of Sri Lakshmi destined for Indra. So they are destined to be together again in this form.
Okay, divine destiny. What's the other story?
Another story he provides is about a young woman in a past life who prayed intensely to the god Shiva for a husband. In her enthusiasm, she repeated the prayer 5 times. Shiva granted her wish, saying she would have 5 husbands in her next life. She was reborn as Draupadi to fulfill that very prayer.
Two quite different, complex mythological explanations offered for the same event within the text itself.
Exactly. And convinced, or at least compelled by these divine explanations offered by the revered sage Vyasa, Drupada reluctantly consents to the marriage.
What do historians take away from this episode, and especially the fact that the text itself offers multiple justifications? What does that suggest?
Well, the mere inclusion of polyandry, even in this exceptional narrative manner, might suggest that this practice could have existed among certain groups, perhaps elites, maybe in specific regions or under certain circumstances. During the long period, the epic was being composed and evolving.
Okay, so maybe it reflects some reality somewhere, sometime.
Possibly. However, the fact that the authors, or redactor, felt the need to provide multiple, elaborate, divine, or mythological justifications for Draupadi's marriage is highly significant.
What does that need for justification tell us? Why not just state it happened?
It strongly suggests that polyandry was a practice that was becoming increasingly unusual, or perhaps was already considered well outside the norm, particularly by the Brahmanas, who were heavily involved in the later stages of the epic's compilation and standardization. They felt compelled to explain it, to legitimize this culturally challenging practice, trying to make it acceptable or understandable to audiences operating under different, more rigid marriage norms, like monogamy or polygyny, but not polyandry.
So the explanations are attempts to rationalize or accommodate something that didn't fit neatly into the dominant social model being promoted by the time the text was finalized.
Precisely. They're trying to smooth over a narrative wrinkle that clashes with prevailing ideals. Historians have speculated on possible reasons why polyandry might have been practiced historically, perhaps to reflect specific regional customs, like those found in some Himalayan communities even today. Perhaps it arose in crisis situations, like a severe shortage of women in a society frequently engaged in warfare, though that's debated. Or perhaps, as we discussed with Hastinapura's description, it's primarily a narrative requirement of creative literature.
A literary device.
Yes, designed perhaps to create a unique dynamic among the heroes, emphasizing their shared destiny and identity, and to drive the plot in specific ways, rather than being a direct reflection of common social reality across India.
And associating such an unusual practice with the central heroes, the Pandavas, makes it particularly impactful and memorable, doesn't it?
It does, and it highlights again that creative literature, while reflecting aspects of society, also has its own internal demands and logic that don't always perfectly mirror historical reality. The epic uses this unusual marriage to explore complex themes of shared identity, shared duty, the unique bond of the Pandava brothers, and the trials they face together.
It's clear the Mahabharata is this incredibly dynamic and layered text, reflecting centuries of ideas, social changes, and storytelling.
Absolutely. And the growth of the epic didn't just stop with the Sanskrit version being finalized, whenever that exactly was. It has had this continuous, vibrant life over centuries, constantly evolving through dialogue between peoples, communities, and writers across the subcontinent, and even beyond.
How did that continued evolution happen after the Sanskrit text was more or less fixed?
Well, regional stories were incorporated into local tellings. The central narrative was retold and reinterpreted countless times in various Indian languages, adapting it to local contexts, beliefs, and concerns. Episodes from the epic were depicted everywhere in sculpture, painting, and performed in innumerable forms of performing arts, from classical and folk plays and dance traditions to oral narrations by storytellers.
It became a living tradition, constantly being reshaped and re-understood by each generation and region.
Exactly. And contemporary retellings continue this tradition today, creatively drawing on the main narrative while often offering powerful new perspectives or highlighting aspects that were overlooked, maybe deliberately silenced in earlier versions.
Mahashweta Devi's story, Kunti Onishadi, is cited as a powerful modern example of this kind of retelling, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Source 17. Mahashweta Devi was renowned for giving voice to marginalized communities, particularly tribal communities. In this story, she revisits the incident of the House of Lac from the Mahabharata, but from a completely different and devastating perspective.
Remind us quickly of the original incident in the epic. How did the Pandavas escape the burning house?
Okay, so Duryodhana builds this palace made of lac, which is highly flammable, intending to trap and burn the Pandavas and Kunti alive. The Pandavas are warned, however, and they secretly dig an escape tunnel. As part of their escape plan, on the night they intend to leave, Kunti hosts a big feast. Many guests come, including the epic notes, a Nishada woman and her 5 sons, who apparently drink too much and fall asleep inside the house. After these guests fall asleep, the Pandavas escape through their tunnel and then set fire to the house themselves. The bodies found in the ashes the next day are assumed to be the Pandavas and Kunti, allowing them to escape undetected. But they were actually the bodies of the Nishada woman and her 5 sons.
So Kunti and the Pandavas essentially used the Nishada woman and her sons as unwitting decoys, sacrificing them to ensure their own survival and escape.
That's how the original Sanskrit epic presents it, a grim but necessary strategic move for the hero's survival. The Nishada family's death is functional to the plot, their identities unimportant. Mahashweta Devi's story picks up years later after the Great War is over. Kunti is old, reflecting on her life in the forest, and she is confronted by a Nishadi woman.
A woman from the same Nishada community.
Yes.
Yeah.
This Nishadi woman reveals that the Nishada woman who was killed with her sons in the House of Lac was her mother-in-law. She confronts Kunti directly, pointing out that in all her years of reflection on her life, her sorrows, the war, the losses, Kunti has never once remembered or acknowledged the 6 innocent lives, her mother-in-law and her 5 sons who died specifically so that Kunti and her own 5 sons could survive.
That is just a profound and incredibly challenging ethical confrontation, shifting the focus entirely.
It completely shifts the perspective. Mahashweta Devi uses this retelling to introduce a critical ethical question about the often unacknowledged cost of the hero's actions and choices. She draws attention to those who were marginalized, anonymous, and sacrificed in the original narrative. It highlights the silences and the perspectives that were not given weight or voice in the dominant tradition.
It forces the reader or listener to look back at the original story and ask, wait, what about them? It's such a powerful example of how modern interpretations can reveal new layers and crucial ethical dimensions in ancient texts.
It shows that the epic continues to be this living source of meaning and debate, prompting us to critically examine the narratives we've inherited and consider the experiences and perspectives of those on the periphery, those often erased from the traditional story.
This deep dive has really shown us the incredible complexity and dynamism of society in early India. It wasn't simple at all.
Absolutely. We've seen how historians have to grapple with these really challenging sources, like the Mahabharata and the Dharmashastras, recognizing that they offer both the ideal norms and tantalizing evidence of incredibly varied, sometimes contradictory realities on the ground.
We've explored the importance of kinship and patriliny as an ideal, especially for elites, but also how practices like marriage rules, exogamy versus endogamy, and succession varied significantly, as seen in that fascinating case of the Satavahanas with their metronymics and apparent disregard for Gotra rules.
And we've delved into the Varna system, that ideal of a birth-based hierarchy, looking at the prescribed roles, the methods used to enforce it, like citing the Purusha Sukta, and powerful stories like Drona and Ekalavya that seem designed to reinforce it.
But we've also seen clear evidence that this system was never a perfect reflection of reality. We had non-Kshatriya kings, the fluidity of jatis and occupations shown by that silk weavers guild, and economic realities sometimes overriding Varna distinctions, as highlighted in that Buddhist perspective of the wealthy Shudra.
We examined how notions of ritual purity led to the sharp, painful division of untouchability, with the harsh rules for Chandalas described in texts and seemingly corroborated by external accounts from travelers like Faxian and Xuanzang. But we also glimpsed alternative views and critiques in texts like the Matanga Jataka, suggesting potential resistance or at least different criteria for status based on ethics or spirituality.
And we've discussed the significant impact of access to economic resources on social differences, often sharpened by gender, as seen in inheritance rules and the different ways men and women could acquire wealth. We contrasted this with alternative models of status based on generosity and martial prowess, particularly in ancient Tamilakam, offering a different social logic.
Overall, the picture that emerges is one of a society that was far from static or uniformly governed by simple universal rules. It was incredibly dynamic, marked by this constant tension between prescriptive texts and lived experience, significant regional diversity, and these complex processes of integration, negotiation, exclusion, and adaptation.
And understanding these historical dynamics is incredibly valuable today, isn't it? It helps us see the deep, complex roots of social structures, inequalities, and diverse practices in the subcontinent. It provides perspective on how things have changed, and in some cases, how they've persisted or transformed over millennia.
It reminds us that social categories and hierarchies are not fixed or inevitable. They are human constructs that have been debated, challenged, adapted, and reshaped throughout history, and continue to be so.
So here's maybe a thought to leave you with. We've seen how ancient texts like the Mahabharata contain multiple layers of meaning, conflicting explanations for complex events, and how later retellings like Mahashweta Devi's can force us to look at the original narratives from the perspective of those who were maybe silenced or marginalized. Considering this, what does it tell us about how we should approach any historical source, and whose voices we should actively try to seek out to get a fuller, more nuanced picture of the past?
Or perhaps when a text like the Mahabharata evolves over 1,000 years, with different groups adding their perspectives from the original bards to the Brahmanas, the Vishnu worshippers, and those adding didactic sections, how does that ongoing process of retelling and re-editing shape the very history or itihasa that comes down to us? What does it tell us about the power of narrative itself in shaping collective memory and identity?
Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.